Thank you, Pastor. Appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. Happy Sabbath. Good. It is Sabbath, and it's a happy Sabbath. They all are, I think. It's good to pause and take a break from the busy week. Yes, I was a pastor for a number of years, but I never lost my love for earth sciences. And toward about the last 20 years or so, I've been working on programs on the side, because I did have that day job. But on the side, been doing creation ministries, and then eventually Max Torkelson asked me to do it full time. And I was very happy to do that. It was the kind of thing where he asked me, and I'd been at my last church, a university church, where I had some university people that helped me with my science. And anyway, Max Torkelson asked me, would you do it full time? And it was the kind of thing where I said, well, my goodness, let me think and pray about it. Yeah, I will do that. Yes, so it's what I wanted to do. Anyway, here we are today. And why do we talk about the flood? In the beginning, there was water. Why do we talk about the flood? It's because science has a very difficult time in proving a 6-day creation. God said, let there be light. How can you prove that scientifically? You can't. You can go with design, and you can go, what are the chances that nature can do it, and so on. But when you talk about the flood, you can show physical evidence that's pretty hard to refute. And so when we do, creation science does a lot of work with the flood. And hopefully, as you kind of show evidence for the Genesis flood, maybe people will consider the earlier chapters historical too. So that's kind of why we do a lot of work on that. So let's go ahead and talk about the flood. And we'll see. Here we go. The earth also was corrupt before God. Now, I want you to understand why God did something so strange, a strange act for God, destruction. Why did he do that? The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with, what? Violence. So God looked upon the earth. Indeed, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh. You look at how broad those terms are. They clearly include animals as well. Animal kingdom was a problem as much as people kingdom was. So when I talk to kids about stuff like this, I say God had to stop the world because people were so mean to each other all the time. Oh, the animals also were mean to each other. And so kids get that. And I think you do too. So all flesh was come before me, for the earth is filled with violence, the end of all flesh. Well, when you see a picture like this, I'm now going to focus on the grandmas that are present here, and I'm going to take you to task. Grandmas, how many of you are guilty of giving your children, grandchildren, either puzzles or pictures or toys or coloring books that depict the flood like this? Come on now, let's raise hands. Confession is good for the soul. Pastor! If you are trying to present to your children that God will always present or provide a way of escape through the most difficult times that we're going to see in this world, I'll give you a pass. But what does this say about the flood? First of all, make-believe. Yeah, fairy tale, but more so what? It was the happiest day. I mean, can you imagine, kids, how fun it would be to be on the boat with the animals and stuff? Folks, that is a 180. That is as opposite as you can get from the experience that was the flood. It was the universe's worst event ever, save perhaps for the cross. Anyone who saw it were torn by the destruction, by the death, by the suffering. It was a strange act for God, and God was the most torn of all. I want to set that for you just to kind of get that clear. So let's talk more about what happened at the flood. So the search for Noah's Ark in the Adventist circle, we've heard stories about this over the years. There's a lot of interest in the subject of where is Noah's Ark. The good news is it's been found, and there it is on Mars, and it's a Bible shocker. Well, yeah, I guess so. The point is, a lot of the stories involving the ark have been sensational stories. Am I not correct in that? Let me set a little bit of the stage, because how many of you remember the Cold War with Russia? Remember those days? I grew up in Los Angeles. I remember in public schools we'd have air raid drills, and when the air raid go off, you would get under your desk at school, because if the Russians dropped an atomic bomb, you would be safe under your desk. So anyway, in those days, Turkey, which was also in the west, shared a border with Russia, and that border was very close to Mount Ararat and mountains of Ararat. And so the Turks did not want lots of people traipsing around on the mountain in full view of the Russian snipers, on the border guards there. And so they kept people away from the mountain. And what happens when any government keeps anybody away from anything? People want to do it, and what are they hiding, And it's a Muslim government, and they're trying to keep, and all of that kind of stuff. And so for years, there was a lot of drama involved in looking for Noah's Ark. Guess what? We're past that now. We've got satellite imagery. We can go anywhere on Mount Ararat we want to, and we have been looking. And the news is we haven't found it. But it did show up in northern Kentucky. There it is, and that's opening day. How many have heard of the story of this $100 million building project of a full-scale replica of the Ark? And it is amazing, and I hope you get a chance someday to go back and see it. It is amazing, and it is, like I say, full-scale, largest wooden structure in the world. And lots of detail, and if any of you people here worked with wood, you would especially appreciate the efforts put into building this. The bottom deck, there's 3 decks. The bottom deck has animals, middle deck has storage, and the top deck has a full gospel presentation, which actually I kind of appreciate having that. They're very, very forward in their thinking. Anyway, okay. Incidentally, where did the Ark go if we can't find it? I think this is my theory, and it's a good theory because you can't disprove it. I think when they got off the Ark, they looked around, they didn't see any Home Depots, there wasn't any Lowe's in sight, there were no forests even, and so I think they turned around, looked at the Ark, and said, well, there's our building supply right there. So I think they probably dismantled it and used it for other things, possibly anyway. So, flood stories from around the world. There's a Babylonian version of the flood story that dates to the 21st century BC on cuneiform tablet. If I'm a cynic, and I'm aware that Moses couldn't have written it down any sooner than 600 years later, a cynic would say, okay, the Hebrew story in the Bible is a Hebrew version of a Babylonian myth. But guess what? There's a lot of other people that thought, ancient people that actually had flood stories. For instance, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Persians, Egyptians, Assyrians all had flood stories in their ancient records. Let's go to Europe. The Romans, the Greeks actually had the date pretty close to the biblical date. Scandinavians, Celts, let's go to Africa. All of these tribes, but pre-missionary contact, had stories of the flood. Let's go to Asia. The Koreans, the Eastern Russians, Mongolians, you know about the Chinese actually having quite a reference in some of their characters to the flood. Let's go to South Pacific. South Pacific, like Australia, that would be the Aborigines. Tahitians, the Hawaiians all have flood stories. Let's go to the Americas. Some of the ancients, like the Mayans and the Toltecs and the Incas, as well as a little more modern, we think in terms of modern tribes, even the Eskimos have a flood story. You can get an idea now. They don't have earthquake stories, they don't have forest fire stories, they don't have hurricane stories. They have flood stories consistently everywhere. Something about the gods being angry with man, and somehow man survives it. Well, this is the Smithsonian Institution for Native American History. Did you know there was a specific museum for Native American history, part of the Smithsonian collection, in Washington, D.C.? You go up to the top on the inside, and it winds up like a teepee. I was there, and I listened to a Native American woman who had a tour group with her. And she's showing them around, and she says to her group, now, my people, talking about her tribe, my people, have a flood story. She looked at her group and said, you people do too. And then she paused and she said this, maybe there's something to it. And I thought, in the Smithsonian Institution, how cool is that? Only Native American could get away with that, but that's pretty cool. Pretty cool. Anyway, so the point is, perhaps there is something to it. Now, for centuries, the Western culture that we all live in, European culture and science, all understood that when it said on the day that all the fountains of the great deep were opened up, and that would also include volcanic action, that affected our understanding and our interpretation of the crust of the earth. The mountains, the valleys, and everything were to a great extent formed by actions of the flood. That was a standard understanding for centuries, until something happened in our educational system, and that is places like Oxford and Cambridge, where we have the rise of secular humanism. Now, secular humanism has co-opted science. Do you understand that? Secular humanism has co-opted science. And incidentally, as Protestants, we are beneficiaries of a pendulum swing that swang through Western culture. It started off with people like Martin Luther and others who were tired of the authority of the Pope. And so we broke away from that authority. And then Europe got tired of kings. And so they started to form governments that got away from that authority. Well, that pendulum kept swinging to the age of reason, where we got tired of all authority, tired of God's authority and the Bible and everything else, and we're just going to go with what we can reason, right? The age of reason. Well, that affected our universities, our religion departments, and certainly our science departments. And you understand that Europe now is post-Christian in their culture. Do you understand that? Pretty much post-Christian. Interesting. People like this were involved in it. This is the father of modern geology, and he proposed uniformitarianism. And that is that everything is going on at the same rate, and definitely not from a catastrophe. That affects everything in science in dates. Absolutely everything. The decay of rocks, ice pack measurements, tree ring measurement, everything is based on uniformitarian views. And that is a standard approach, and it was definitely a reaction against thinking like the flood and so forth. Let me give you an idea what uniformitarianism would look like, practically speaking. You go to the Grand Canyon, you see the Colorado River coming through there, and the Colorado River, you measure how much dirt comes out in 1 year. You look back at the canyon, how much is missing? Do the calculations, and that is how old the canyon is, end of story, period. And that's uniformitarianism in a nutshell. That's a good example, okay? So that was a standard understanding for the last couple of centuries until people like this came along. This is J. Harlan Bretz. Now, I've done this. He's a UW geologist. I did this lecture across the street from Pullman, Washington State, okay? You know, the Cougars. Well, this is a Husky here, and trust me, there's a little bit of this. And so I said, sorry guys, this was a Husky who came up with this discovery. This geologist went to Dry Falls. Ever been to Dry Falls? North central Washington, kind of in the Grand Coulee area. He went up to Dry Falls, this is called Dry Falls, looked at it, and even though there's water in the bottom here, just some pools, he looked at these cliffs and he said, you know what this looks like? This looks like Niagara Falls with the water turned off. And so something happened in the past that's not going on now. And that's a forbidden thing in geology. Only current things are the way to interpret old things. So he presented his findings to the geologists of America and got a flat, we don't believe in floods, basically. We don't believe in catastrophes. And he said, well, look at the evidence. And he said, well, where's the water? And so he went up to Missoula, Montana. And if you go to Missoula, Montana, and you look at the mountains around Missoula, Montana, you see shorelines all the way up the sides of the hills. And he said, well, there was a lake here at one time. And the lake was caused by an ice dam across the Clark Fork River. And it made a lake the size of one of our superior lakes, Lake Michigan, Lake Ontario, that big of a lake. Then historically, it broke through the ice dam and emptied that lake in the matter of 1 to 2 days. Can you imagine the force and the power of the water coming through? And he found out that it went right through, down through Spokane, where I used to live, and right on out through the Columbia River Gorge, made the gorge much wider, deeper, and did that in what we would call the Ice Age. Incidentally, flood models include Ice Age models and actually are easier to explain than millions of year models. But anyway, So he came with his evidence to the geologists. He would take pictures from airplanes showing giant ripple marks. They just wouldn't accept it. And finally, after 40 years, he got some of them to come to Dry Falls and take a look. And they told him, okay, Harlan, now we are catastrophists. We agree, something happened here in the past. But it took 40 years. Why? Because the standard model in science was to reject catastrophes as explaining what we see. And science is not as quick as you might think to reviewing their models. They kind of are defensive about their models. Actually, that was one of the reasons that I had a problem in UC Riverside back in the day. Okay, so yes, what Harlan was still alive. He was an old man when they accepted his theory, but it's called the Missoula Flood, if you've ever heard of the Missoula Flood. But then he said, we need to look at the Grand Canyon now, because the Grand Canyon gives evidence of being formed quickly, not over millions of years. For instance, let's see. Where were you? We just celebrated. Celebrated? Surviving, I guess, is what we celebrated, right? May 18, 1980. That was yesterday, right? 38 years ago. So looking around, I think some of you were around. And, on that Sunday morning at about 8 o'clock. And we learned a lot about, believe it or not, flood geology or catastrophic geology by studying Mount St. Helens and its effects. Incidentally, in the Adventist Church, we have a strong belief that the dark day and stars falling happened in New England because God allowed it to happen there where people had Bibles and wanted to put it all together with prophecy. In the same way, I think God allowed Mount St. Helens to happen in our neck of the woods in this day, these last days, to give us additional evidence for the flood. I really believe that in the same way. So we had, at the peak of this eruption, we had 1 atomic bomb per second in power going off, and some of you have stories about this, but let's keep going. One of the things I want you to understand about a volcano, there's two ways of looking at a volcano. A volcano is a bump in the ground, basically, something trying to get out and pushing up all the material to try to get out, whether it's lava or gas or something pushing. Some tops have cracks in them, and that's like Hawaii in Kilauea, where there's vents and there's no explosive eruption so much as it just kind of flowing out, although it's getting kind of interesting there right now. But anyway, that's been going on for 50, 60 years, pretty much nonstop. So stuff just flows out and down into the ocean and makes new Hawaii. That's a very good thing. Other volcanoes are corks on the bottle, and that's what Mount St. Helens was. There were no cracks. The pressure was building. The north face of Mount St. Helens started to push out up to 5 feet a day toward the end, and finally push it out so far that when a little tremor took place, it dropped that whole north side. It just slid right down, and when it did that, that was a cork off the bottle, and bam, out it came. And so you can see right here in this picture, this is what used to be up here. So this is sliding down. The north face is sliding down, broken free. It was pushed out so far, coming down, and because of that, bam, that's the cork off the bottle, and out comes all that explosive gas and dust and ash. And 57 people died in that. Of those 57, 8 were in areas considered unsafe, and you had to be there by permission or stubbornness. Harry Truman, right? You heard that story. You were in danger areas, but 49 were considered to be in safe areas. And that's because the eruption was much larger than they had expected it to be. David Johnston, the famous young volcanologist that was standing right on that ridge where the visitor center is today, said the famous words in the radio. Do you remember what he said? He said, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." And they never found him. They built a visitor center there. We learned a lot in that eruption about catastrophes. For instance, how to make 250 square miles of toothpicks, giant toothpicks. I want you to think about the power of the force of that eruption, that blast that came out down the side of that mountain at 300 miles an hour. You cannot outrun 300 miles an hour. And tremendous heat. Think about what it would take to knock down that many trees. Pop, 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 pop. Think about that, knocking them right off of their stumps. The heat would vaporize the bark, the branches, the needles, and leave all of these logs. Now the north face, because it had ice and snow up at the top, melted, and the water came down and washed a bunch of those logs into Spirit Lake. Now these two guys right here are creation scientists, and they're actually there with permission to study these logs. This is what they found out. After a while, these logs did this. They're floating like this, and then eventually they did this. And then eventually, they went straight down and sank into the soft bottom of Spirit Lake. And the assumption would be that more material would come in there and eventually would cover those trees up in the lake. Well, okay, so he studied that. This is a couple of pictures they took. There's a picture of a log looking upward at it, and it's floating straight up and down. There's one that sank already in the Spirit Lake's bottom. Then the same scientists went to Yellowstone. How many have been to Yellowstone? Incidentally, when you're at Yellowstone, remember this on your next visit. It is a mega volcano ready to go at any moment. So you enjoy your visit and have a lot of fun there. Yeah, so anyway, they went to Yellowstone and asked the park for permission to check out Specimen Ridge in the petrified forest there on the side of this ridge. Now, here's what there is. There's a whole bunch of these giant trees sticking out of the ground, petrified. You can't put your arms around them. They're huge. They're solid rock, and they're standing out straight up out the side, up and down the side of this ridge. And understand this, that this is how they are. There's a few here, then there's layers of dirt, and there's a few here, more layers, 50 layers of dirt, trees all the way up and down the side. Always been presented as long age, a snapshot in time, right? Like hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, because you can imagine they grow, then they get covered and petrified, more trees grow over long age. Well, the same scientists at Spirit Lake asked for permission to dig around the base of some of these trees. What were they looking for? Looking for roots. If they found roots, what would that mean? They grew there, but if there's no roots there, those trees got there some other way. And were there roots? No. There were no roots. In fact, they measured the tree rings on the trees at the bottom with the trees at the top, and they'd all been growing together. So, long story short, they presented their findings that whatever took place at Mount St. Helens, is taking place, is just a tiny representation of what took place in Yellowstone years ago, but was a catastrophe that made lots of flat layers and petrified objects and so forth in essence, a very short time. Now, I was in Yellowstone at the bookstore, and I was looking through some things, and I heard a DVD playing Sights and Sounds of Yellowstone. So they talked about Specimen Ridge and the petrified forest. Oh, let's see what they say about that now. It says, thanks to studies down at Mount St. Helens, we now know that these were all caused by, a volcanic event. And I'm thinking, yes, do they give creation scientists credit? No, but that's okay. But anyway, creation scientists ask questions that others don't. That would never have been otherwise discovered. So, kind of interesting. The other thing that we learned from Mount St. Helens is you can make a Grand Canyon rather quickly. This is called the Little Grand Canyon off the Toutle River, and you can see there's layers of rock that are actually graded beds. You can see them a little easier here. And because of the water erosion, we've got layers, flat layers, very flat layers, and a canyon right through them, which looks remarkably like this. Very flat layers, and some of these layers are actually the size of several states. And I want you to understand how difficult it is to imagine what it would take to make several states-sized, flat deposits, and I mean flat deposits, the same thickness more or less, for hundreds and hundreds of square miles. Very hard to imagine from a river delta kind of deposit that would make that. So anyway, lots of flat layers, and all of these are supposedly representing millions of years, and that they would have been the top of the ground for millions of years, and yet we don't see evidence of erosion within those layers. In other words, if that was the top of the ground, why aren't there a few valleys and things in it that you would expect being on the top of the ground for a while? Anyway, Grand Canyon. Go upstream from the Grand Canyon and you will see this place. What is this place? Monument Valley. Look at how quick you guys are. A lot of churches, there's that kind of sound when I ask the question. Anyway, Monument Valley. Take a look at this place. It's on the Utah-Arizona border area. And take a look at this. You can imagine that there was at one time the top of the ground right there. And we're talking about many, many, many cubic miles of material is suddenly gone. And I don't mean not just down here, in some other zip code. So lots of material. What can do that? What can cause that? And there is only one answer, folks, and that's water with power. Lots of water with lots of energy can remove lots of material and take it a long ways away. And so, incidentally, even evolutionists are agreeing that this looks like something like that happened here. Some kind of what we would call a drainage event. A drainage event. Okay, well, let's just keep going. Incidentally, science is based on trying to get answers to questions. So if you got a good question, you're going to do a little better science. Here's a really good question, I think. As we look at the crust of the earth, and we know water's been involved, what is a better way to explain what we see? From much water over little time or little water over much time. And much of it has to do whether or not you are open in your interpretation to such things as catastrophism. Because if you aren't, then you are limiting your options as to how do you interpret the data. And that's not always good in science. Incidentally, what is the evolutionist Bible? And it's not Origin of Species by Darwin. What is their Bible? The Bible is basically the geologic column, the layers of rock, because in it is the inerrant history of the earth, which actually I agree. You know, take a look at the layers and you'll tell what happened in the past. But how you interpret it is where it matters. This is the standard view. This is not what I hold, and I've got to repeat that because I always have somebody say, so you believe in the millions? No, I don't. That's what the standard view is. Standard view is millions of years. These are millions of years over here, and the record is divided into life eras, Paleozoic early life, middle life, recent life, and then that's further divided into periods. These are also many divides inside of these too. Take a look at this though. Right there at the very beginning of the life record, Cambrian, Precambrian break, supposedly 570 million years ago, supposedly. Life appears, and of the life that shows up at that layer, 32 to 35 types of critters show up immediately, okay? Classification of animals. And that is interesting because the imagination would have it that things start off simple and with a few and break off into more complex in the many, right? Does that not make sense? Over evolution, their model supposedly teaching that. And yet the evidence is that life appears immediately very complex, like, for instance, our friend the trilobite. Heard of a trilobite before? Trilobite's interesting. They're anywhere from this big to this big. And I kind of think of them as water cockroaches. It's probably a mean thing to say about a dead animal, but anyway, I that's how I view them. They certainly lived around the edge of bodies of water. That would mean that in a flood scenario, they'd be covered first. Anyway, they're at the beginning of the fossil record. And because they're at the beginning of the fossil record, if you're an evolutionist, these should be the beginning of life, the simple forms. And yet, a trilobite is every bit as complex as you and me. Now, here's the thing. There are trilobite nerds out there that collect them. There are hundreds of species of trilobites, and there are super, super experts on trilobites. There are some trilobites that have eyes that are not unlike ours. They have some that have eyes like fish. They have some that have eyes like insects. They have some that have eyes on stalks. Okay? Every kind of eye. And this is the beginning of the fossil record. And the point is they've got incidentally, in terms of evolution, eyes are considered about the most advanced of any organ. And yet they have the super complex eyes immediately. Difficult to explain from the millions of years thing. Now, Darwin's view was, I'll just break this down quickly too, that everything changed with lots of successive tiny changes. Tiny changes. Now, that means that all of these things had tiny changes over the millions of years. Here's our great-great-great-grandpa. Single cell life form somehow or other broke into plants and then also into animals without backbones and animals with backbones. We are up here with chimps and lemurs because we look like them. That is the reason we're with them. You understand that? And the idea is if you look like something, you have a common ancestor. So anyway, but it just sounds funnier to say it the way I did. Now, as we look at the fossil record, we're going to find out that these are the areas where we're weak in terms of evolution. We got dinosaurs, we got frogs, we got fish. But according to Darwin, we should have tiny changes over time that have animals developing into fish and into frogs and into horses and so forth. But we got a problem. And if there's no other quote that you get today, this morning, then this one, this is the one to get. Okay? The extreme rarity of transitional forms. This is by an evolutionist, and I consider the source of this guy to have been the Pope of evolution. I mean, this is Stephen Jay Gould, a Harvard professor of biology that was on every single PBS program that does evolution because he was articulate, he was funny, he was a good quote, and he was a Harvard biologist. Okay, all that. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. What's a trade secret? Is it something that you advertise in the media? Do you do specials on National Geographic or Nature or PBS or anything like that? No. But you talk with your fellow paleontologists about this. Paleontologists are the ones who study ancient things. Trade secret is the extreme rarity of transitional forms. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, but not the evidence of fossils. Did you get that? Okay, let me show you what he's saying. I got to go back to this and look at this. He said the evidence, okay, he says we've got dinosaur fossils, we've got bird fossils, we've got horse fossils. We just don't have any fossils along this trunk here. We don't have anything that's actually a pre-horse or a pre-frog or a pre... Huh? He says the rest of it's inference. That this happened, that's inference. That's the guess from the model. It's just not the evidence. So what is he saying? He's saying the basic view of evolution is inference, but it's not supported by the evidence. Okay, do you ever hear that on National Geographic specials or anything? No, you don't. So point is, the fossil record is not the friend of evolution. And that's a trade secret, so don't tell anybody. Okay. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. So it's a big problem, missing links. Now, Darwin was very aware of this problem in his day. And so what he said was, but we know they're going to find more fossils. It'll fill in the blanks. We'll have those complete little changes over time to make the kinds of animals we see. Here's an evolutionist complaining about the problem. We are now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Yes, we're finding more fossils. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. We have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. Fewer examples. In other words, as they find more fossils, they're finding out that some of the things they presented as pretty good, looking pretty good, are actually not going to work. For example, you've seen this one before in books, right? Have you seen this? And this is the idea of a small three-toed horse evolving, or four-toed horse evolving into a single-toed, hoofed, large horse. Here's the problem. The fossils don't support that. The more horses they find, the more evidence they have that this is not what happened. Okay? Now, why do they keep it in the book? And this is their answer. Seriously, this is their answer. They keep it in the book because we know the evidence doesn't support it, but we still think the model is trying to teach something that we think did happen. So we're presenting it as a teaching device, even though we know it doesn't work when you look at the fossils. Okay. Interesting. All right, it's kind of interesting. For instance, evolution believes that a bat used to be a mouse, or at least they had a common ancestor. So at one point, mice, one branch of mice, moved into flying mice, which are bats. Okay, what did Darwin say about that? It should be little changes, little changes. And so seriously, if you're thinking little changes, this is what you would expect the fossil record to show. 100% mouse, then up above it, a 90% mouse, 10% bat, then an 80-20, 70-30, 60-40. Are you with me on this? Little changes, eventually working into a full, real bat. The fossil record has mice and bats. And that's all we have. We don't have those transitional forms. So they know that, and this is one of the, okay, I don't have the slide up, but this is one of the ways they think they can deal with it. And Goldschmidt, a famous Jewish scientist, as well as Stephen Jay Gould, who thought there might be something to it, came up with the following idea. They call it hopeful monsters. In other words, somehow it must be that a mouse had a bat for a baby. Now, they can't explain the biology. They don't understand how it could work, but it does fit the fossil record better. No question about it, so give them points for creativity. But the biology is crazy to try to imagine a mouse having a bat for a baby and then the bat somehow finding another animal that they could mate with and continue the bats. So anyway, that's part of the problem. Actually, in the fossil record, whenever you see very unique body shapes like this, when you see it, you know what you've got. You know what you've got when you see these things, very unique body shapes. All of these critters show up immediately in the fossil record without any sort of ancestor that's sort of like them or on the way to them. They show up immediately in the fossil record. Oh, this is it. Yeah, that's the Jewish guy there. The idea of hopeful monsters. Whoops, not atomistic changes, not little tiny changes, but hopeful monsters. Richard Goldschmidt. Okay, let's move on to how you make a fossil anyway. Take a look at this fish. It's a beautiful fish fossil, beautiful. Look at the detail of the scales and everything, just gorgeous. How do you make that? Well, evolutionary scientists, this is not a believer in the Bible, but this fellow said this: the explanation of the origin of fossils, especially talking about fish fossils, by the theory of uniformity and evolution contradicts the fundamental principle of these theories that nothing took place in the past that does not take place in the present. He says, today, no fossils are formed. So he said, you know what, our model that nothing happened in the past that's going, that isn't happening now, doesn't fit, because nothing is making fossils like we have the fossil record, especially talking about fish. And he's talking about how we have billions of fish fossils. And typically when a fish dies, its body gets devoured by something else, doesn't get covered and preserved. So he said something else has gone on in the past. I had the very difficult duty this last January to travel and spend a week in Tucson, Arizona. In January, and leaving the beauty and the loveliness of the Portland area. And spent a week there for the International Rock and Gem and Mineral and Fossil Show that is the world gathering of all sources of the above. And it's just total fun. I mean, Tucson gets taken over by literally thousands of dealers, mines, mining operations, everything from all around the world. So spent that difficult week there. And every morning I would pray something like this: Lord, help me find something today, as I'm looking around, that will help support my talks on these subjects. This morning, I prayed this, and this is where God took me to this place. Take a look at that shell. Look at the colors of that shell. It's unbelievable. Now, this shell is this big. Okay? So get an idea. This shell is from Alberta, Canada, from the Rocky Mountains there, one place in the world where this has a coating of aragonite, and it comes out like that. And I mean, rainbow colors, that's not doing it justice. Spectacular. I asked the guy, and this was a mining operation that found these, I asked the guy, can I take a picture? Sure, go ahead. $60,000. I didn't have that on me at the time to purchase this, so the picture will have to do. But I did buy a fragment, a couple of inches square, and later on today when I have my fossils out, and incidentally this afternoon, we'll have all these fossils out. These are museum quality, good stuff. Anyway, so I asked this fellow, can you tell me how this was formed? Knowing that he's an evolutionist, probably long ager. And he said, well, I don't know much about how it was formed, but I will tell you this. It's buried under 6,000 feet of sediment. 6,000 feet of sediment. That's over a mile thick of sediment. And sediment is water deposited. How do you get that kind of, and this is an ocean-going animal, how does it get preserved under that kind of material? It's evidence of the flood. So, something beautiful, preserving evidence of something that was terrible, the flood. Anyway, it's really spectacular. I'll show it to you a little later today, the piece. Okay, is this going to work? Are we jammed up? Okay, so big problem for creationists, and we've got problems, and if I don't talk about these problems, I appear in secular groups to be a Bible-thumping, not know-it-all, kind of thing. So, anyway, which is probably what I am anyway, but don't want to appear that way too much. Fossil order, and animals are definitely in fossil order, found in orders, in layers. This fellow was a surveyor in England in the early 1800s, and he noticed that fossils are always in the same order, and wrote about it later, seemingly always. I don't know about you, but I imagine that the flood, when I first heard about it as a kid, I imagined that the flood was some kind of a giant washing machine that just churned and tossed everything and threw it all around and eventually kind of settled out as sort of a homogeneous kind of deposit of some kind. It's not the way it is at all. We've got animals in certain locations, and they're pretty much there in fossil order. So that does usually kind of support the evolution theory over against the flood if you don't have a good model or good way of explaining that. Well, we're starting to get some ideas. Here's one way. Who is this man here? Does anybody know? It's a younger picture of Dr. Leonard Brand of Loma Linda. And this is actually a piece of Coconino sandstone that I have in my collection. It comes from the Grand Canyon area. It's supposed to be Permian layer, which would make it 250 million years old, if you believe those models. 250. It's got a whole bunch of 1-inch wide footprints in it made by a lizard of some kind. Sharp-toed, no webbing, so it looks like a desert lizard. And it's sandstone, so the famous way of interpreting this is this was a dry deposit in a desert made by a lizard. Okay, but without water. Well, Dr. Brand wondered if you could do that, especially to get this mound behind each footprint. Long story short, he put some sand in a tank, took an amphibian or a salamander, you are my volunteer, put it in there, start walking. So started walking around making footprints. Dry sand couldn't equate this. Wet sand couldn't get it. Saturated sand still couldn't do it. Finally put enough water to where water was above the sand, and the animal was literally splashing as it made the footprint, and that's how he got it. So notice this footprints, there's at least 3 animals going this way, this way, this way, all in this direction. They're mostly going this direction. Why are they going in that direction? They are walking away from rising water, and they are splashing, and they're looking for higher ground. They're going toward higher ground. Now that tells you something, that there was in the flood time for animals to react and to try to get to higher ground in those 40 days and 40 nights. So we see many cases where, incidentally, we almost never find the bones of the animal on the same level as the footprints. But anyway, we never found a single bone of this animal. Don't know what it was exactly. But anyway, so animals had time to move during the flood. If they had time to move, we could imagine that they could get to some places where there were hills, tops of hills, and could go no further. And these would be communities of animals, and they're general. They probably all lived in the same area, and this is their last place or last stand, and got covered up somewhat, shall we say, organized or related to each other in those ways. In the same way we could imagine dinosaurs likewise, and probably not having as much up here as you and I have, and not as able to get to the highest ground. That's a possibility. It's a partial answer, not a great answer. I'm going to finish up here with a little bit of a reference to the flood. It's the ark itself. How big was the ark? How big was the ark? Don't say big. That's what kids do. Big. 450. That's exactly right. 450. What did they use as measurements? Cubits. What's a cubit? That's a cubit. Okay, from here to here. Incidentally, here's a question for you to consider. Was it a Moses cubit or a Noah cubit? If it were a Noah cubit, we might be talking bigger than the standard views. But we'll go conservative. We'll go with Moses. Incidentally, how does Moses have an ark of the covenant and Noah have an ark? What's an ark? It's a wooden box. Exactly right. It's a container. It's a box. It's a box where you put your precious things. I tell kids that. You have a box that you put your precious, that's an ark. Because Noah didn't tell, God did not tell Noah to build me a boat. There's a different Hebrew word for that. So anyway, said build me a box. So that's, and you know, Ark of the Covenant could be translated technically, 10 Commandment box. It just doesn't have the same flow. Let's go with Ark of the Covenant. Okay, Ark was that big. And it was 1.5 million cubic feet capacity. If you were to use a standard train to load it up, you could load 522 cars in the ark. That's using the conservative numbers. So pretty big. Pretty big? All right. We don't know what the Hebrew word beramin means. We don't know what kinds means. We don't know if that's a species, a genera, is it higher up, what? We don't know. It's not a scientific term. I listened to a very good presentation by a biological professor from Southern Adventist University who explained how he thought it was talking about family. If it's family, like cat family, dog family, wolves, then you'd only need 700 or 800 pairs. I think that's probably a little high. I think it might be another layer lower. But let's, for the fun of it, let's just say there were 16,000 pairs of animals. And you would have over, with a year's worth of provisions for that, plus the people, and you would still have over half the ark left. Let's see if you get the correct answer to why the ark had over half of its space still left, if that were the numbers we were using. And incidentally, kids get this answer quicker than adults. Oh, there's a kid. Yes. Can you imagine why there was so much room in the ark? Huh? People. Okay, what do you mean people? You're right, but what? More people. You know how many times I've had adults say, maybe they're making babies, maybe they needed room because they were fighting, and maybe they needed this, and maybe there was poop and stuff, and now all these different answers and stuff. And when a kid will just say, because God had room for more people. That's a good answer. That's a good answer. God has more room. Anyway, okay, we're going to wind up here in just a second, if this works. This is a hilarious one, but check this out. This is a population expert, and writing about it and complaining about the size of the number of people we have today. If we came out of Africa 1 to 2 million years ago, we should be walking up and down the roads of Portland like this. Excuse me. We should be having many more times more people than we have. So they know this, and they're basically saying something wiped out the vast majority of variation historically. Possible culprits include disease, environmental disaster. What are they saying? Something happened in the past where, I don't know, we got down to like 8 people. You know, there's no explanation. You know, what could have happened? Don't you want to be the kid in the room that goes, ooh, ooh. I think there's something in that book called the Bible that says we got down to 8 people. We dodged extinction. Okay, we did. So, okay, I don't have time to deal with a couple of these things, so I'm just going to go real quickly to the end, if this does advance. Bible says that the mountains rose and the valleys sank down. Mount Everest, you go up to Mount Everest, to the 26,000 foot level of Mount Everest, and they are seashells. 5 miles up. Okay, how did they get up there? Was the water up there, or was the mountain at one time down here? The mountains rose, the valleys sank down. So that's pretty good science for 1000 BC. Pretty good science. Richard Dawkins, a famous atheist, says the Bible was written by Middle East camel herders. In other words, nothing up here, right? Pretty good science for 1000 BC, those camel herders. The mountains rose, the valley sank down. Here is a prediction for Seventh-day Adventists. Okay, well, at least Adventist. What's an Adventist? Somebody who believes in the second advent of Christ. Look forward to Jesus coming back. There's a scoffer who's going to make fun of Adventists in the last days. Where is the promise of his coming? You guys have been talking about him forever. Where is he? He's not here. All things continue as they were from the beginning of creation, uniformitarianism. Everything continues without any catastrophic big step in the history of man by God. He's not going to do that again because he hasn't done it in the past. This they willfully forget, that God created the world and God flooded the world. The two great events, creation and judgment. Two great things God does. Okay, here's my very last slide. Apparently, Jesus thought the flood happened. Whereas in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark did not come until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. That tells me something like this. The Seahawks will be in training camp. There will be a famous marriage breaking up in Hollywood. There will be a Middle East bomb go off somewhere. Somebody in Washington, D.C. will either say or do something stupid. There will be a traffic jam in Portland on 205. And Jesus will come. Life will appear to be going on normally for the world that's not prepared for it, for the second coming. And it will be that surprising to them. The only reason we're still here, the only reason that we're having church today and we're still here on this planet is because there's still room in the ark. There's still room in the ark, and God is waiting to fill up the ark. And folks, are you ready? Are you ready? This is why I do this. I want everybody to be ready. I show evidence of the flood. That's evidence to me that Jesus is coming back. Are you ready?